Hello, I'm Michael Bunch. I'm the plant pathologist at North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. I'd like to take a moment to share with you our research results on optimizing fungicide application timing in black beans. I'd like to stress that this research sought to evaluate when you should apply the fungicides when conditions favor white mold as you enter bloom. Okay. Most people, when they're asking the question of fungicide application timing for white mold, they're asking the question of whether conditions favor white mold or not. Okay, I'm asking a different question. I'm saying, okay, you know that conditions favor white mold. It's cool and it's wet. Your dry beans are entering bloom. When do you spray? Because it's not as simple as just, oh, they're enter bloom and it's high risk for white mold, I should spray. No, it's not that simple. Application timing matters, and what we have sought here is to optimize that timing. Okay, this is work done in Carrington and Oaks, North Dakota. Oaks is irrigated sand in the southeast corner of the state, and row spacing was either 14 inches or 28 inches, depending on the study. We seeded either 100,000 or 110,000 viable seeds an acre. Spray volume was 15 gallons an acre. These were hand-applied studies, okay, with a handheld spray boom, with the treatments pressurized with carbon dioxide. We applied with fine droplets in 2017, medium droplets in 2017 in Carrington, and fine droplets in Oaks in 2017, and then droplet size calibrated relative to canopy characteristics in 2020 to 2022. Okay, the interval between the applications was 10 to 14 days, depending on the study, and we did these studies with 6, 12, 15, or even 16 experimental replicates, depending on the study. We use a large number of experimental replicates in these studies in order to negate the impact of variability in white mold pressure across the footprint of the study. We assessed white mold by individually assessing plants for white mold severity at the end of the season. We actually manually clipped the plants at the base, windrow them down to dry, and pass that through the combine rather than straight harvesting. The reason why we do not straight harvest these studies is because we have invariably differences in lodging across the footprint of the study that are not correlated with disease. Okay, and what that does is it impacts. If we were to straight harvest that, we would get a lot of variability in our yield data associated with the variability in lodging, which had nothing to do with the fungicide treatments, nothing to do with our study objectives, and just creates noise. And so to make sure we don't have any of that noise, and we're only assessing the impact of fungicide application timing on yield, we actually manually clip the beans to simulate knifing, windrow them, and pass that through the combine. That way you have highly accurate yield data that reflect the response to disease management and nothing else. Okay, and the irrigation was applied throughout the growing season to create conditions favoring white mold so that we could learn how to manage the white mold. So what did we learn? Okay, so I'd like to start off with one study with black beans that had a canopy that was at or near closure as the beans were entering bloom. Okay, and so you can see an average canopy closure of 88% when we had their initial pin-shaped pods. Okay, and so it's really close to closure. And what I want to show you here is the response to a single fungicide application versus two. The bar graphs show you the average white mold severity, which is the percent of the canopy diseased, and the yield, pounds per acre. And then those circles show you the yield gain conferred by the fungicide. All right, so what you'll notice right away is that there's a penalty to applying too early. Okay, I have the results sorted by the percent of plants with initial pin pods. Okay, and what is that? As soon as a dry bean blossom senesces, it produces this tiny pin-shaped pod. Initially, that's 1/4 inch long or so. Okay, And that pin-shaped pod then expands to become our seed pod that we harvest, right? But immediately upon senescence, you'll see this pin-shaped pod. By assessing the percent of plants with pin-shaped pods, what we're doing is assessing the percent of plants with dead blossoms. The white mold only comes through the dead blossoms, so this is really a really cheap and easy way to look at percent of plants with dead blossoms, because looking for dead blossoms is a lot more work than looking for pin pods. And all we do is we go across the footprint of the study, and in our non-treated controls, we'll assess 10 plants in a row on a random spot in that plot and look at how many of those plants have those initial pin pods. Okay, and so when we apply it at 1 to 20% of plants with initial pin pods in a single application, you notice that our disease control was not nearly as good, and our yields were not nearly as good as waiting till we had 60 to 100% of plants with initial pin pods. Okay, now when we made 2 applications, 10, in this case 12 days apart, notice that actually that application timing shifted forward a little bit. There's a penalty to applying too early, just like we saw before, and now it looked like a penalty to applying too late. Even though we don't see statistical separation, the trend is very clear. Okay, and so why is there a penalty to applying too early? We've always been told that there's a penalty to applying too late. But, and that's, okay, we've always been told there's a penalty to applying too late, and that's because, you know, we have to apply that fungicide before the pathogen infects. There are a few fungicides that give us limited curative activity, but that curative activity is limited to 24 hours after pathogen infection. Not all the modern fungicides give you that, and that disease control is never as good as prevention anyhow. Okay, so really to get good disease control, you got to get your fungicide on before the pathogen infects, and that's before you have this microscopic level infection event occurring. And this is like 2 to 3 weeks before you see disease, because the pathogen grows in the plant microscopically before you see disease for a couple weeks. Okay, and so anyhow, that's why you see a penalty applying too late. But why do you see a penalty applying too early? The reason why we see that is because when we apply that fungicide, we're protecting that growth that's there. The growth that's there when we apply the fungicide gets protected. And we know that as those dry beans are entering bloom, they're putting on lots of new growth. And that new growth is going to be unprotected. So when we apply before we have really hardly any dead blossoms, we're applying before infection. And the cost of doing that is that the new growth is left unprotected. And then infections come in through that new growth. Okay, so that's why there's a penalty applying too early. Now, why is the droplet size, why is the application timing optimum different for 1 versus 2 applications? Well, if you're going to do 1 application, that 1 application is not enough to extend your protection throughout the season. And so what you have to do is basically sacrifice a few early infections in exchange for extending that protection a little bit later through the season. You get a little bit more new growth protected, and you extend your protection later into the season. If you're going to do 2 sequential applications, you're going to top off that fungicide and protect that new growth. So now you don't want to sacrifice those early infections, and you want to go on just a little bit earlier. So that's why you see in this case, when the canopy was near closure, as you're entering bloom, that you had optimum of a single application at 60 to 100% pin pod, plants with pin pods, but yet if you're going to do 2 applications, that first application needs to be on about 30 to 50% of plants with initial pin pods. So we did more testing, and what you see here are the combined results across 5 studies where we had the canopy was open as we made that first application, but in this case the conditions were more favorable for white mold overall. Okay, and what you can see right away is that with a single application, the fungicide was overwhelmed by the disease, and we got hardly any response to the fungicide. Okay, when we did 2 sequential fungicide applications, on the other hand, Now you can see we got a decent response to the fungicide. Okay, and what you can see is the same relationship we saw before, where there's a penalty to applying too early and a penalty to applying too late. In this case, our optimum was about 1 to 20% of plants with initial pin pods for that first application. Okay, to summarize what we have learned. If you're going to make only a single application of fungicide targeting white mold to black beans, you had best make sure that the disease pressure was quite moderate. Because what we've seen is that when disease pressure is high, conditions are highly favorable for white mold, 2 applications can be very easily overwhelmed in black beans. Okay. That said, if you're quite confident the pressure is going to be moderate and you're only going to do a single application, we optimize disease management, white mold management in black beans with a single application when 60 to 100% of plants had initial pin pods, not earlier. Okay. Now, if you're going to do 2 sequential fungicide applications targeting white mold and black beans, we optimized white mold management when we applied almost just as soon as you saw pin pods. So 1 to 30% of plants had initial pin pods. Okay, and again, there's a significant penalty to going on too early. So if you have 30% of plants in bloom, but 0% with pin pods, you should wait a couple days. Okay, and but again, there's a penalty to applying too late, so you wouldn't want to wait beyond that. Again, these recommendations for application timing are based on the assumption that conditions favor white mold as you enter bloom. If conditions do not favor white mold as you enter bloom, you should delay your applications. Okay, again, so summarizing what we have learned, there's a penalty applying fungicides too late for white mold because you cannot cure existing infections. Remember that the time interval between the pathogen infection and you seeing white mold is 2 to 3 weeks. And you have to get that fungicide on before the pathogen infects, which is well before you see any disease. Okay. Also, remember that there's a penalty to applying too early, and this is because the new growth is not protected by the fungicide. And so you have to pay very close attention to the application, to the growth stage that your dry beans are at, if you see that conditions favor white mold as you're entering bloom, and you want to have a good response to your fungicide. Here's an illustration of what I mean with new growth not being protected by the fungicide. These are field peas, but they illustrate the exact same concept that we see in dry beans. These field peas were treated with a fungicide targeting powdery mildew at bloom initiation. After bloom initiation, well, the peas continue growing upward. Okay, what you see here at the end of the season, shortly before senescence, what you see here is that the canopy, the lower part of that canopy, which existed when we sprayed that fungicide, is perfectly protected against powdery mildew. The new growth that the peas put on after we sprayed the fungicide has powdery mildew. Okay, the same thing happens on the dry beans. That's why we can't spray too early. Okay, so of course this creates some challenges. First off, you'll notice that even with our optimal timing, our disease control was not great. At best, 50%. Second, achieving this perfect application timing is difficult. Okay, dry bean growth is often variable within a field, and the dry beans won't be at the same growth stage across an entire field in many situations. Second, not every day is a spray day. Okay, and the dry beans can move from 20% pin pod to 60% pin pod in 2 to 3 days. Okay, so how can we address that challenge? Okay, what we essentially can do is the only thing we can control is to try to mitigate the impact of the negative consequence of applying the fungicide too early. We can't get it until some new fungicide chemistry is invented that gives us curative activity at a much greater scale than we see now. We can't do anything against the penalty of applying too late. Okay, but we can theoretically mitigate the impact of applying too early by tightening the interval between applications. Rather than 10 to 14 days between applications, we apply, say, at 7 days. What that does is it protects the new growth sooner. and reduces the number of infections that come in through that new growth. Okay, so in theory, tightening the application interval should help with disease control. The problem is that that second application at 7 days later may not extend protection to the end of the season, which then may necessitate third application. So we have begun investigating this research question in separate studies evaluating the impact of fungicide application interval and frequency. And I'd recommend you reference that work. At this point, we only have results from pinto beans and kidney beans, but hopefully those results can help inform your decisions across all the market classes. And going forward, we hope to add black beans to that research. Before I close, I give very sincere thanks to my staff, Aaron Faust, Twin Collis, Jesse Hafner, and Gabby Henson, and our seasonal workers and the staff in Oaks who helped with this research. These staff work very long hours, are very dedicated, and it is their dedication that makes this possible. Second, I'd like to give very sincere thanks to the funding agencies that cover the cost of doing this work. These are large studies because of the number of experimental replicates. They're all irrigated. In Carrington, that irrigation is done with micro sprinklers, which creates an enormous amount of cost for pipe and fittings and sprinkler heads. In Oaks, it's done with a linear irrigator, and anyone who runs an irrigated operation knows that those irrigators have costs to operate and maintain. And so that funding from the North Harvest Bean Growers Association and from the North Dakota Crop Protection Harmonization Registration Board, this is a board administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture and the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. These funding sources provided the funding for the salaries of our staff and also the operating costs of these studies. I'd also like to give sincere thanks to the companies that do contract testing with us, because it is that funding that allows us to invest in equipment. That sprayer that you saw, that was purchased with those funds. That sprayer that we built to do these applications, that was purchased with these funds. Our combine was purchased with these funds from that private contract testing. And so that's an integral part of making this research possible. Finally, I give very sincere thanks to Bollingberg Seeds, Green Valley Bean Company, and Kelly Bean Company that donated the seeds for our various fungicide application timing studies across the market classes. So sincere thanks to Kurt, John, and Dean for those donations. That reduces our costs and makes this research possible. Thank you for your time. I hope this work has been of benefit to your operation.